On today's show, going to be bringing in a Clipper beat writer to talk about Lawrence Frank's comments right after we drafted Yannick. Said some interesting things about Kawhi and how the young players on our team might get more of a look next season. Going to be talking about it all on today's Locked On Clippers.
You are Locked On Clippers, your daily Los Angeles Clippers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, sir. You are locking in with the Clips. Thank you for making Locked On Clippers the first listen of your day, your team every day. I'm your host, Darian Vaziri, born and raised in LA, been a Clipper fan for 20 years, been covering the team for 5 on my own YouTube channel, Dime Dropper, and 3 right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and help us get up to 8,000 subscribers. And you can listen wherever you get your podcast for all things LA Clippers. This episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. All right, in this episode, joined by my good friend and Clipper beat writer, Joey Linn, one of the best in the business, to talk about Lawrence Frank's comments. He was there. Joey, welcome back to the show. I haven't had you on since I think Westbrook was on the roster. It's been that long.
Well, thank you for having me, man. I appreciate it. Always happy to jump on here when it works out.
Yeah, man. And obviously, hopefully during the summer, you have a little bit more time. I mean, how's the schedule been? I know it's very hectic for a beat writer, especially one like yourself that, is traveling sometimes with the team is during the season.
Yeah, I appreciate that. No, it's definitely been busy still during the summer. I think that's the good thing about the NBA is that it's a 365-day-a-year league, as we all know. So there's always something going on. There's always something to follow, always something to keep up with. But yeah, now the focus shifts to the draft and training camp.
So yesterday, we drafted Yannick Conan Niederhauser. I had not watched the Penn State game this year. And, I know in ways you can relate with how grueling it is, to cover every single game of an NBA team. And we still want to be, hip to what's going on around the league. It's so hard to find the time to, watch full college games. How much did you know about Yannick, or do you know, or have you just been kind of scrambling and asking questions and trying to find out as much as you can about the guy after we drafted him?
Yeah, honestly, I'm not afraid to admit that when it comes to a lot of these late first round picks, it's a challenge for me as well to keep up with these guys because the NBA schedule is so grueling, like you mentioned. To keep up with the college game is tough, especially when a lot of times, as we know, the Clippers do kind of come out of left field with their pick. I don't think a lot of people had Yannick, going to the Clippers. Not a lot of people even had him going in the first round. So he was not a guy that I knew a lot about. There were other, late first round picks that I kind of had my eye on. He was not one of them, but have spent the last day or so researching him and obviously looking into more of what Lawrence said about him and talking to people who, were kind of around a little bit closer to what Lawrence was talking about, not just, him taking him out to dinner and things like that, but also when they got him in and got him checked out, because Lawrence did mention that he has a little bit of an ankle ailment right now as well. So did talk to a couple people about that, but will humbly admit did not know a ton about this guy going into the draft.
So same here, as I said, but one of the things that Lawrence did say was, and we see it in the highlights, is this is a guy that they want to be a lob threat, a vertical threat, a lanky athlete that can get up and down, hopefully catch some lobs from James Harden, whoever the point guard is, if he's on the team in several years. But with someone like that, so I heard someone ask him a question about who they would compare him to, and he seemed hesitant to throw out names, but he threw out Derek Lively and DeAndre Jordan. There were some people saying, well, wasn't this the exact same stuff we were saying about Kai Jones? Is there anything because that's always seemed like a confusing thing of why Kai Jones didn't really get an opportunity. Do you have any insight, just being a little closer to the situation, on why Kai Jones maybe didn't get a shot, even though he has some of those same things that they described Yannick having, that athleticism, lob threat?
That's a question that I actually asked Ty at least once last year, because I do try to do my best at asking the questions that Clippers fans are, kind of wanting. I'm tapped into Clippers Twitter. So
I was going to say, I'll be the first one to say that it seems like you always ask the questions that, covers the pulse of where the fan base is at. So I really appreciate that.
No, and I appreciate you recognizing that, because I think, a lot of times, and understandably so, fans get frustrated because, they don't feel like certain questions are asked. Maybe not everything gets put out there, or maybe not everything, comes across everyone's timeline, but I am very tapped in to Clippers Twitter. I see pretty much everything. So when it makes sense to ask a question, I will ask. And I did ask about Kai last year. And, Ty, he's a coach unlike some others that, are more willing to kind of really be hard on their players to the media, he's never going to be that way. He's always going to protect his players, even if it's not, 100% truthful. So he kind of took that route when I asked about Kai, saying, it's hard for him. He came in, had a little bit of an injury, it was kind of hard for him to catch a rhythm. But really, the truth of the matter is that Zoo was so trusted last year that, there wasn't really a whole lot of backup center minutes available. And we know Ty's tendency to go small when the opportunity presents itself. He was never going to hesitate to, throw Nico in there at the 5 if Kai or Drew, as we saw, didn't really assert themselves as a reliable option. Unfortunately, Kai just didn't. Like he did get a couple of limited opportunities. I think he probably could have gotten a few more, but the fouls were a major issue. A lot of times just out of position defensively, rough around the basket, which is to be expected. But then, of course, he goes to, elsewhere and it ends up, kind of showing what he can do. And it's a tough situation for the Clippers because that's not the first time that something like that has happened. But at the same time, there is always context to those situations. But I think that hopefully kind of answers your question. Ty is already a little bit hesitant to trust younger, more inexperienced players. And when it's a backup 5 who's backing up Zoo, who was arguably the team's most important player when you look at the season's entirety last season, there just was a really short leash for Kai, and he didn't do enough in the minutes that he got to extend that.
Yeah, I guess Mo Bamba's just a couple of years in the league were enough for them to, at least from the outside looking in, because I'm not at the practices. I don't see, who's sharper in terms of knowing the schemes of what we want to do offensively and defensively. But Mo Bamba had more NBA experience, and it seemed like, he gained the trust of the coaching staff more. I guess because Mo Bamba didn't really produce and was sent away, I think that's where a lot of fans, including myself, were like, you know what? Why not give Kai some run? At least he's such a raw athlete, which Yannick looks like he has some of that as well. Now, as far as can he be contributing next season? So we all in the draft room. I was at the party. I know I saw you there from a distance. We all were like, can whoever we draft be the backup big for Zubats next season? When Lawrence Frank was talking to us, and then when he was talking to you, he kept using the phrase or the words "in due time" in reference to Yannick. Do you think that's kind of his tell of saying if you think he's going to be the backup center next year, Clipper Nation, you're kind of dreaming because we're still trying to be a championship contender in theory. And we're probably going to go out and get another guy, and Yannick will be that third center because he said we want 3 centers.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up because that does kind of play into the question that I asked him. He actually unprompted brought something up that was pretty interesting, where the percentage that a 30th overall pick has to stay in the league for a certain amount of years, and he explained how low that is. And that kind of played into a question that I already wanted to ask him, and that was when you look at the Clippers draft history. Obviously, in the Kawhi and PG era, they were always picking late first round because Oklahoma City had all their picks. And, even if they did own their pick, the Clippers were a competitive team. So their picks have consistently been late first round. So that already puts you at a disadvantage as a player. You're just not going to get, a lot of really extended opportunities as a late first rounder. A lottery pick, you're going to be on a team that more often than not is rebuilding, wants to invest into you as a player and your playing time. So there's a lot of factors that go into why late first round picks just don't stick. So I asked him, I said, does that, when you look at how your first round picks in recent years have played out, does that make you want to kind of refine your approach, both from a drafting standpoint, but then also once you get these guys into your organization, how you approach things? And his answer was interesting. I know you wanted to bring this up, but he basically said, we're going to have our younger players up with the team more. So instead of having them spend more time in the G League down in San Diego like they have in years past, he wants them up practicing with the team because he said, obviously, the game opportunities are going to be limited. But if we can get these guys in high-intensity practices with the veterans, maybe they open some eyes. Maybe they kind of force Ty Lue's hand a little bit more than would have been possible if they were just down in the G League. Because I think it's another thing we've seen a lot in recent years. Guys dominate down in the G League, and some Clippers fans, even myself included in the past, have said, look at what this guy's doing down there. We got to get him up. But clearly organizations, they don't see that as something that's going to easily translate, and understandably so. So I don't expect him to be the backup center next season. I think he's going to get maybe more opportunities than other late first round picks for the Clippers have in recent years. But just with the way that the team is right now, I think we all kind of know what their emphasis is, and that's continue to stay competitive. They're really not throwing around the word championship a whole lot as much as they were in recent years.
Oh my God. It's funny you say that. We're going to get into that next because it's exactly where I was going. So coming up, we're going to be talking about the direction of the team and something I've noticed about the way Lawrence Frank has been speaking lately. I got to tell you a little something about Skims. When I found out Skims was making underwear for men, I was intrigued. I've heard so much about their quality from friends and family, so I had to give it a try. And let me tell you, it lives up to the hype. I've always had issues with underwear, fit, comfort, whatever it was, just trying to find the style that suits me best. And Skims changed all of that. Their men's line offers something for everyone from boxer briefs to classic briefs, all designed with the perfect balance of comfort and style. I tried the Skims boxer briefs and I'm hooked. These are perfect for my active lifestyle, given that I'm always exercising to some degree or demonstrating things with the kids when I'm coaching and whatnot. Shop Skims Men's, or just have to, bust their ass real quick. Shop Skims Men's at skims.com. Let them know we sent you. After you place your order, select podcast in the survey and select Locked On Clippers in the drop-down menu that follows. That's Skims. All right, back here with Joey Linn of SI Now, Clipper beat writer, to talk about Lawrence Frank's comments after the draft. We just talked about Yannick Conan-Niederhauser, the newest LA Clipper, but we just agreed kind of that unfortunately it seems like he won't be the backup center because it is so hard for, especially as someone they describe as so raw and not close to the finished product, even though he is 22 years old, on the older side for a player coming in the first round, that we are going to be competing. Now, I've noticed that, and you just brought it up, I've noticed that Lawrence Frank continues to say we want to stay competitive, as opposed to when we first got James Harden, it was we want to compete for a championship, and it was like he was talking with his chest out about it. So do you feel as though Lawrence Frank deep down kind of knows that championship is unlikely, but we know he can be really good? Or do you think he still has kind of like that same, I don't want to use the word delusion, but like as a player, how like you have to have kind of that belief,
irrational confidence. Yeah,
exactly. That you can do it. We might think, yeah, the Clippers are too old, but if I'm Kawhi Leonard and James Harden, it's like I'm still an all NBA level player when healthy. I can still get us over the hump. Lawrence Frank, he's not playing, he's not coaching, he's managing things. Do you think, am I looking too far into that, or is his compete word and not using the word championships kind of telling?
I don't think you're looking too far into it. And it's funny because this is actually something that I asked him straight up before last season, because I noticed that before last season. To me, it was a stark difference because you mentioned it. The entire Kawhi and PG era, especially after they got James, it was championship or bust, right? Like even if that phrase itself wasn't used, you could tell by the way they were talking about these teams, that was 100% the expectation. Yep. The messaging shifted entirely before last season, and understandably so, right? Like I can respect that they weren't trying to pretend as if they were in that upper tier of championship contenders thing. Everybody knew that they weren't. But I asked Lawrence straight up before the end of last season because I noticed the absence of that word. And I said, when you're building out this roster with what you guys have right now, do you believe this is a championship group? And I still, you can probably go back and find the tweet, but I do remember his answer almost word for word. He said, I don't like to put ceilings on groups. I don't like to, say what we can or can't do. Essentially, we're going to go out there. We know the identity that we're going to have. We're going to be a hard-nosed team. We're going to compete. We're going to tough out every single night. And to me, that was a nice way of saying no. Like that's not the expectation. But what I will say is that, and this has also been brought up a lot recently, the internal expectations last season were much different than the external expectations, where you had pretty much everybody, even some within the fan base, thinking this is probably, maybe a lottery team, maybe a play-in team, right? Like 50 wins was not something a lot of people expected. Internally, I think the Clippers felt they could get close to that. But in terms of thinking that they were in that upper tier of championship contention, I never got the sense, and I don't get it now either.
Right. I noticed that exact same thing, and I do remember that question. And Lawrence does an amazing job of he's had so much experience being a coach, being a GM, being an assistant coach. he knows how to answer questions and like sometimes say a lot, but also not say anything. And in that one, I think you could kind of read between the lines. Now, as far as Kawhi, he dropped something very interesting yesterday, that Kawhi Leonard continued to train all the way until the end of the finals to try to simulate, his body working hard all the way to June, just in case he gets that opportunity, next season, or we're able to get to that point. Now, of course, you cannot replicate the intensity of playoff basketball with any sort of workout, but I don't doubt that Kawhi is working very hard. I know he's, his work ethic is amazing. But let me ask you this. What did you make of those comments? And also, when we talk about why the team isn't a championship team, do you think Lawrence Frank doesn't have trust necessarily maybe in the supporting cast? Do you think it's the age of Harden and Kawhi? Where do you think the hesitation is? And what did you make of the Kawhi statement?
Yeah, well, it's funny, and not to continue saying, oh, this is a question that I asked, like, it is something that I brought up when we talked to Lawrence at the end of the season. I asked him straight up just his level of confidence that a Kawhi and James duo in 2025, 2026 is championship caliber. And he gave me a pretty similar answer to the one that I just described, from last year. And that's understandable as well. I think the expectation is that if those two are healthy, you're going to be a playoff team, potentially, the home court advantage, first round type, threat. But still, that championship word is not being thrown out. So I just wanted to kind of, start my answer with that, and then I'll expand on it a little bit. But going back to what you said about the Kawhi workout thing, I mean, I think that's great, right? I think every Clippers fan should be excited about that. Like you said, you can't replicate playoff basketball, and it was great to see him finish a playoff run healthy, this past year for the first time since 2020. But again, it was a first round exit. And I think that that's something that he was really upset by, because his comments were really interesting to me throughout the entire postseason, because we know, regardless of what people say about him, we know he is one of the great competitors of all time. Like he absolutely is. You don't get to the heights that he's gotten to without that competitive fire. But despite that, he really kind of diverted away from that type of language whenever we were talking to him during the playoffs. And he just continued to reiterate how happy he was to be on the court. And, he didn't even really want to think about anything other than just the thankfulness that he had to be out there. So I think this was big for him to be able to finish a playoff run healthy, even though it didn't go as nearly as deep as the Clippers wanted it to, and then continue to push that as much as he can, in those types of simulated workouts. But again, I think Clippers fans are understandably and rightfully cautious when it comes to getting too excited about that, because last season was also very unique. He essentially got, a late start to the year, right? Like, I think that was pretty intentional as well. Like, of course, he had some setbacks along the way, but the Clippers weren't going to rush him. I think that was part of the plan all along, was to let's kind of start him later in the year. Let's not push this, especially once he got the operation done. And then that essentially like starts his season clock later. And when a lot of times these injuries were popping up in the playoffs, you kind of hope that you were able to kind of bypass that by starting him late. So I think there is some understandable reason for like cautious optimism, where you're excited that he's doing this, but you also, as Clippers fans, understandably so, you do want to see it play out that way for a full season.
Yeah, and something that was interesting that Lawrence said, and I think we all felt it, is because of what you just said, the Kawhi schedule and how his timing aligned with the playoffs. I think we really felt like we could make a run. Like, I think it really was believed that we could make a run. It was a little deflating to lose in the first round, especially when we did finally get Kawhi Leonard healthy. As far as looking at your perspective of it all, like the basketball analyst side of things, what did you think was the biggest reason why we fell a little bit short? Because there's a lot of people that think it's, we just didn't get enough shooting from the role players like Norman Bogey. If they had just been better, we would have won. There's some that think, Kawhi wasn't getting enough shots up. Then there's some that are like, there's a lot of Kawhi fans that are like, oh, it's all Harden's fault. Like, you know what I mean? So where do you stand with just the way why we fell short a little bit?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm glad that you bring it up, because I certainly don't look at last season as this massive success story that I think, organizationally, that I think they're trying to play that up a little bit. And I get it, right? Because like the external expectations were so low coming into the season. And you still hear it talked about now. Like, even yesterday, you obviously were in the room. It's like, 50 wins. Like, people weren't expecting that. But
18 out of the last 20.
The last 20, yeah. It's like, so you hear that a lot. And I get it. It's impressive, and especially when compared to the preseason expectations. But I can say, with absolute certainty that the expectations, like I said, internally started much higher than they were externally, but they even changed about midway through the season, and especially during that late season stretch. This was a team that 100% had belief going into the playoffs that they could go as deep as anybody, which is why I don't see a 7-game first-round exit to the Denver Nuggets as a success at all. And I think internally that is the true feeling, regardless of how it's kind of portrayed. But to answer your question more specifically, I just think that the team, were they good enough to beat Denver? Maybe they didn't, but were they really a true contender? I don't think so, because I just don't believe that a Kawhi Leonard, James Harden led team in 2025 is in that tier. I think they could have made the Western Conference Finals, but I don't think they could have beaten Oklahoma City. And I just think that is the honest truth, right? Like when you have a team that just isn't quite in that tier, and I think there was a lot of teams this year, right? Like I think a lot of teams could have fallen anywhere from a first-round exit to a Western Conference Finals exit. The Clippers, it just kind of came down to some margins in the first round, and they obviously ended up getting bounced. But that's my honest opinion. When you're just a team that's just not quite in that tier, that's kind of what you leave yourself open to, and the margins become a lot smaller. And as we know, the Clippers weren't great on the margins in that first-round series.
Yeah, that's what I always say. I mean, I always get a lot of heat for it because, there's fans that want to hear that we are, but it's just tough. The league's going younger. It's the teams that were just in the finals are a great example of that. And I think the biggest thing that stood out for me was, the endurance of Shea and Jalen Williams, how much they were able to go. And after 2 7-game series, it's taxing. And I just don't know if we'd have the legs to do that. But anyway, coming up, let's talk about, speaking on the topic of younger, we're going to be talking about Joey's direct question to Lawrence Frank and how a youth movement may just be an impossibility given the franchise direction. I got to tell you a little something about Game Time. Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with friends or family? Maybe it's game day and you suddenly realize that you want to go. That's exactly where Game Time comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without the stress. And I know there's been plenty of times where I've gone to games last minute, whether it be playoff games or regular season for whatever sport. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, merchandise, or even invite a bigger group to come with you. Game Time makes it possible. Game Time makes buying tickets fast and simple. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to the first pitch, and they've got incredible last-minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. Game Time is the official ticketing partner of Locked On MLB, making it easy to browse the app for an exciting upcoming MLB game. You got to try to find a good deal on these Dodger tickets right now because they're the champs, and it's very difficult right now. I've heard the tickets. I haven't even started looking so far this season, unfortunately, but they've been crazy from what I've heard. So Game Time can help you with that. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download the Game Time app. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right. Back here with Clipper beat writer Joey Linn to talk about the youth movement question. So there's a lot of Clipper fans that want to see the young guys play more. And that's why it was a very satisfying answer to hear that Lawrence Frank said, we want some of these young guys to stick around with our actual team more this season. But let's just talk about why it's so hard. So many Clipper fans want us to go younger. But my thing is this, and I say it all the time, being a young, and Lawrence touched on it, being a young player on a team that internally thinks that they're a championship contender, you have to be really good. Like, you have to be really solid on both ends of the ball. Do you think Ty Lue and the coaching staff could have done a better job of incorporating some of these young players? Or do you think it's truly because they may not be as good as some fans think, and if we do play them, we're going to suffer as a team because of it, and that's going to hurt the main men on the team, which is Kawhi and Harden, who want to win now?
Unfortunately, I think it's much more the latter. It's a lot easier to say that, Ty needs to give these guys some more run, but kind of like I talked about earlier in this episode, a lot of times these guys just aren't quite who either the organization thought they were when they took them, or just hoped that they could become. And I've gotten caught up in this myself, but when you look at the G League, I think it's really interesting because a lot of times, these guys are down there doing things that they're really not going to be asked to do at the NBA level. And Jordan is a guy I think about, and this isn't a knock on Jordan because I think that he has a lot of talent and could absolutely, be a rotation player in the NBA at some point. But when you look at what he's doing down in the G League, he's obviously got the ball a lot more. He's really good at getting downhill and getting to the free throw line. But when he's out there, the Clippers aren't really doing that, right? And understandably so. They're not going to put the ball in his hands and say, go get fouled, right? We saw him do that a couple of times. They need him to knock down open threes, and he didn't do that. They need him to, stay away from fouling, and he didn't really do that, at a really high level. And then obviously the defense was kind of, come and go as well. So I think that's part of it. The Clippers just don't really have, at least currently, those types of prospects that Ty Lue has seen enough from to trust. But to go back to what you had mentioned about my question, I think that at least gives the Clippers more of an opportunity to see these guys both in high intensity practices, which Lawrence mentioned. And then also too, if you think about it, if, somebody gets in foul trouble or somebody, gets banged up during a game, if you have this guy up here with you, it at least gives Ty Lue that option, as opposed to if he's, down in San Diego or in sweats on the bench because he's inactive, that just doesn't really present the opportunity. So I think by having these guys up here more and less often in San Diego, that'll at least slightly increase the opportunity for them to play. But I still wouldn't expect it to be like this tangible shift that fans may be hoping for. But I also want to make one other point, like going back to what I said about, a Kawhi and James-led team probably not being in that tier 1 of championship contenders. I see both sides of this argument, right? Like I see the Clippers side of it, where they're like, look at the Western Conference. Pretty much outside of OKC, the Clippers feel like they're good enough to win a series. And I agree. I think that's a rational belief. And of course, nobody roots for injuries, misfortune, or anything like that. But we have seen the way that postseason series can play out, that durability that you mentioned. Things happen, opportunities present themselves. If you give yourself a chance to be in the mix, things can happen. Things can break your way. That's obviously never happened in the history of the LA Clippers, but you do, understandably want to give yourself a shot. So I want to acknowledge that side of things, just because I think it's unfair to play it off as something like completely impossible or unrealistic. But I do want to speak to the fans as well, who feel this frustration with the lack of youth movement that the Clippers have had in recent seasons, because I do think the organization has had a bit of a cop-out when you talk about, the age of their stars and this window of contention, because I specifically look at that 2021-22 season, right? That was the year when Kawhi was out all year. PG did not play very much because he had an injury almost all season. And instead of, potentially selling high on guys like Reggie and Marcus and, getting some youth back in the mix, seeing what you could maybe find internally and externally, they pretty much tried to turn Reggie and Marcus and some of these other guys into like makeshift Kawhi and PG type players, where it's like, no, we're going to play through them. We're going to keep our winning, season streak alive and try to make the playoffs. And they ended up making the play-in. PG got COVID. And that was just kind of like, in my opinion, a completely wasted season. So I do think that there have been opportunities in the last, half decade, that season in particular, to try to see what you could do youth wise. Even if you just, if they came out of that season with either one player, or two players, maybe a guy that they got in a trade for a veteran or somebody they discovered internally that turns into a rotation guy, I think that would have been a much bigger success than, continuing your winning season streak. So I think that's where a lot of the fans are frustrated as well. Where it's like, we're not expecting these 30th overall picks to become, starters, but there have been opportunities organizationally in the last half decade or so to try to prioritize youth over being, a slightly above average team.
Yeah, that was an interesting season. I will say, though, Terrence Mann and Amir Coffey are a good example of guys that were able to break in because they were probably a little more NBA ready. And that season, Terrence, I think that was the best season of Terrence's career, to be honest, 2022. Amir Coffey, to some degree, kind of broke out, but then he didn't end up becoming a rotation player right away. It took him a while. It took till after the Harden trade. So, yeah, I'm kind of with you. Now, here's the unfortunate thing, because then people are going to be saying, well, Joey, well, Dime, you guys are both saying that the Clippers aren't a true contender. Why not just go youth movement? And so there here poses the question. If we choose to play these guys and see how good they really are, that's probably not a very good basketball team. And the Clippers have made it very clear that they always want to, at least Ballmer's made it clear that his MO is that he always wants to compete. He doesn't want to ever bottom out. We also don't have the means to bottom out. Do you think the Clippers' resistance to doing all that is more because, or to, go a different direction is more because the lack of pick situation, they can't really bottom out? Or is it more Ballmer's pride in, we're never going to be a team that's quote unquote tanking? I don't think all tanking is shameless, though, developing young guys and letting them go through the trials and tribulations of NBA basketball.
Yeah, I mean, look at OKC, right? Like, they had a couple of seasons, when Shea first got there, like 20, 25 win seasons. And of course, I'm not saying that to compare the Clipper situation to that, because obviously the picks that you mentioned, but yeah. I just wanted to really just kind of affirm your point where you say that sometimes that is necessary, right? Like Shea and some of the guys there that went through those seasons, I think became better for it. And they might not be the champions right now had they not taken that approach. But to answer your question more specifically, I think it's a little bit of both. I think right now, like, at least Lawrence is definitely acknowledging the fact that, like, hey, I don't know what people expect right now. We don't own our picks. Like, it's not the time to go in that direction. But he certainly hasn't stopped there when explaining why that's not the case. Every single time he has mentioned that the way that Steve is, the way that this organization operates, they want to remain competitive. They want to try to win. And when he says that, he always mentions Intuit Dome. He mentions LA, and the fact that, like, the Clippers are always going to have an opportunity to be in play for the type of players that the Clippers want to bring in. So I think that's what's pretty interesting about it. I will say, though, I think they could stand to take an approach similar to that post-Lob City pivot, where they did recoup what they could for Blake and CP, even in the sign-in trade, because that CP sign-in trade ended up being like one of the most important things in the organization's history, with the kind of that bridge that they had. It didn't work out, unfortunately, but that bridge that they had from Lob City to the Kawhi and PG era, I think they could stand to try to do something like that. Of course, I don't pretend to know exactly, what Kawhi and or James could fetch in a deal, if anything, and I'm not advocating for that either. But I do think that an approach like that would certainly be something worth considering, where obviously you're not going to bottom out and tank. But I think part of the reason why the Clippers were such an attractive destination for Kawhi and PG was not just because of Southern California, not just because of the arena coming, but because they had established a winning culture of a team that wasn't a contender, and nobody expected them to be a contender. I think that's okay, right? Like, I don't think you need to go into every season thinking that we have a puncher's chance at, a championship. If you come in with a competitive group, and I will say, I think that's where Ty Lue can be at his best at times as well, when you do have a team that, maybe lacks the star power, but has the competitors to try to make something happen. I wouldn't be opposed to seeing something like that. But again, I also don't pretend to know what the logistics would look like, because again, we don't know what some of these guys could fetch in a trade. So
exactly. That's the biggest question mark, because, if you just took Kawhi Leonard and James Harden off the team and we're just playing these guys, I mean, it would be terrible. So, it is all about knowing what's going on and what these guys' value could be, if they're even being shopped. Of course, James Harden, this summer is going to be big for him, figuring out what he wants to do with the player option or get a new contract. But yeah, that is something that Clipper fans need to consider when it comes to the youth movement conversation. Does Ballmer ever really want to go that direction? And will that prevent the Clippers from having another homegrown star like the guy whose jersey is behind Joey, if you're watching the YouTube version of this show, Blake Griffin, that, I think to this day, you ask Clipper fans, he is probably the most beloved Clipper. And I think that feeling, and I'm just speaking now, totally putting on my fan hat, like, it just sucks that we're in this situation, just honestly, because as much as, Kawhi has been great for the Clippers in many ways, with Blake Griffin, like, I knew we weren't a championship contender in 2018, but I remember saying the words to my friends, like, I do not care if we lose every single season with Blake. I'm willing to walk out of this experience like the Jazz fans with Stockton. Like, we'll lose every year till he's gone, but I'm willing to keep going with him till he gets it right, because I loved him so much. So I can't wait till one day we can maybe feel that again, but I don't know if, as you said, we're always talking about picking up free agents and getting guys. So that's going to be an interesting balance. But if you have anything to add on that, go ahead and tell people where they can find you. It's been awesome to have you on again, Joey, as always.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me, man. No, I feel the same way. And it's funny because I actually thought you were going to bring up Shea when you were talking about that, because I think a lot of Clippers fans think a lot of Clippers fans felt that way with him, right? And I
Yeah.
will say, I personally push back against the idea that nobody knew he was going to be this. And I'm not bringing this up to talk about the trade or whatever. Like that's, that is what that is. But if anybody followed me from the beginning, way back in the Clips Combos days, you know that I started my platform really just to complain about the fact that Doc was playing Avery Bradley more than Shea. And I have a couple Instagram posts from way back in the day where I said this guy's going to be the best player in his draft, future superstar, all that. Was it delusion? Maybe, but I believe it.
Well.
Yeah, and it happened. So I think, having another guy like that, especially because the Clippers, lost Shea and had to see him become what he became, would be amazing for the fans. And is that ever going to happen, at least in the near future? I wouldn't expect it to, just because of the way that things are going. But I will say this too. I think there is a sense organizationally that, like, if they can align Kawhi's contract or James' contract with Kawhi's, ride this thing out, be that competitive, puncher's chance type team, and then clear up the cap space and use Intuit Dome, use Southern California, use Steve Ballmer, use all of that to bring in, the next big superstar. I think everybody kind of knows, like, that's the plan. So maybe it might not be the next homegrown guy, but I do think that the next franchise player is coming at some point. So just want to throw that out there. In terms of where to find me, I'm pretty much most active now on Twitter, obviously, or X, whatever you want to call it these days, at Joey Linn _. And then, of course, I do have my Instagram, Joey Linn _NBA, that I post on during the season, but not a whole lot going on right now, to make Instagram real. So I'll do that back when the season starts up. But no, I appreciate you having me, man. Always fun jumping on here.
Always, my guy. And you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Dime Dropper Pod. Subscribe to Dime Dropper on YouTube for all things LA Clippers and NBA. And of course, Locked On Clippers, free and available wherever you get your podcast, 5 days a week, all throughout the summer. We'll be having every single update for you right here, including our second round pick picked on Thursday night. We'll be talking about that on Friday as well. Appreciate everybody for joining. Appreciate Joey for joining. The age-old proverb continues. Go Clips.